Welcome to Echo Ekoji, the podcast where we explore the many voices and stories of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism today. I'm Andrea Chapman, president of Ekoji Buddhist Temple.
And I'm Joe Gochi, a member of the Seattle Buddhist Temple and an Ekoji virtual member. Today we are truly honored to welcome a friend, Reverend Don Castro, Rimban Emeritus of the Seattle Betsuin, a pioneering voice in American Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and a guiding light of the EcoSangha Movement.
Reverend Castro served for 30 years in Seattle, shaping the spiritual lives of countless people, including many of us. His insights on ecology, interdependence, and the Dharma continue to inspire us through his monthly Wheel of Dharma columns and through decades of dedicated teaching.
We'll explore his personal journey to Shin Buddhism, the deep influences behind his ministry, and the EcoSangha vision he helped define.
Reverend Castro, welcome to Echo Ekoji. It's an honor to have you with us. Let's begin with your path. What were some of the earliest experiences or questions that drew you towards Buddhism?
Okay, can I start with Gasho?
Yes.
Namo Amida Buddha.
Namo
Namo Amida Buddha.
Namo
Namo Amida Buddha.
Namo
Namada, namada,
Namada.
namada. Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be here. I was at San Jose State University back in the late 60s and early 70s. And my roommate took a class in Buddhism, which was very popular. It was held in the music auditorium. There were so many people who had signed up for it. And Dr. J. McCullough was the professor. And I think what really struck me at that time was, I had been raised in a tradition where belief was very important. And I was raised Catholic. And of course, the essential statement in Catholicism is the credo, which means, translates as, I believe. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Da, 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 da. And I remember Dr. McCullough talking about beliefs. He said, he made the statement once, man, which we in general, back in the 70s or late 60s, actually, we said mankind, man. So he says, man is a concept secreting animal. And I thought, ooh, that's a wonderful statement. And it made me realize, belief systems are not, just because you believe something doesn't make it true. And I think that's what really struck me at that time. And there was a book by a longshoreman, actually, in San Francisco, Eric Hoffer, who wrote a book, The True Believer. And, we had just come out of World War II and fascism, and then we had, communism and the McCarthy era and all. And so this idea of beliefs as not necessarily being true and going back to experience. When people, even today, people ask me, what do Buddhists believe? I say, well, we don't believe anything. And they look at me and like, well, that's a flaky religion. What do you mean you don't believe anything? And I say, well, it's like believing in gravity. It doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not. You better know how it operates. And so Buddhism starts with experience, not with belief. And that was very attractive to me back in the late 60s when I became a Buddhist. And I wanted to pursue it. So I had met my teacher, Reverend Philip Eidman, who had a big influence on my life. He came to San Jose State. He was a friend of Dr. McCullough's, and he lectured, and I sought him out and started going to services at his house. And he had monthly meetings at his home. He was a fascinating person. We can't go in that direction. Maybe I'll write about him sometime. But anyway, through Reverend Eidman, I learned about the Institute of Buddhist Studies. And he also helped me to to get a conscientious objector, which at that time I thought I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. And he phrased that very interestingly. He said, at this point in his life, when this is for the draft board, his letter said, if at this point in his life, it would be harmful for Reverend Castro to engage in violent actions. And over the years, especially I think after the Khmer Rouge, I changed my perspective and realized that when you have a 10-year-old, 11-year-old boy with a automatic weapon who kills you if you look at him in the wrong way and is completely brainwashed, sometimes violent actions are necessary. And so I did change, but I had alternative service to do, and that was at Kaiser Hospital in Santa Clara, and I worked as a janitor. But it allowed me to transfer to Kaiser Hospital, Oakland, and attend the Institute of Buddhist Studies. So I went through that program there, and that was and that's where Eidman Sensei also continued to teach. He and Reverend Kusada. Reverend Kusada was a practitioner. He was a remarkable Japanese Renaissance man, I think, and he affected a lot of people's lives. But anyway, that was my journey. Your Bishop Tsuji, who was Reverend Tsuji to you, came to me one day and said, well, what are your plans? And I said, well, I'm just, studying. And he said, well, have you ever thought of going into the ministry? He said, I was the first person, I think, ever to pay tuition to the Institute of Buddhist Studies. And so Bishop Tsuji said, well, if you go in the ministerial track, you don't have to pay tuition. So I said, all right, I'll go to the ministerial track. So it wasn't like, some devotion to the ministry. It just happened to be, and I never thought of being a professional minister at that point in my life.
Oh, wow. I have to tell you that we're only on the first question, and I already had shivers. And the reason is that in the winter and spring quarter of my freshman year at Western Washington University, I took 2 classes from Professor Rutan, and I was encouraged to read Eric Hoffer's books, multiple books, and engaged in a letter exchange with him at that time because I was writing research papers and I had him as a primary source. Wow. So
Wow.
a little shiver there. So you were ordained Nishi Hongwanji in 1975. I was in the second half of my first year of teaching in that year. What do you remember about that ceremony and about hearing the words, "You've been brought here by profound causes and conditions"?
Mm. Well, that expression, profound causes and conditions, it just started me thinking, and it's not anything that you realize when it's said, but you think about it and you ponder it, and the causes and conditions go deeper and deeper and deeper, But what I remember most about that ceremony was I went through it with 2 other people from Switzerland, and Mr. Chevrier and Mrs. Tone. Mr. Chevrier was in a wheelchair, and I was pushing his wheelchair. And Eidman Sensei was in a wheelchair, and I pushed his wheelchair around Japan. So, I got a lot of experience pushing wheelchairs in Japan. And at that time, Japan was not set up at all for disabled people. It still isn't, but at that time, it really wasn't. But anyway, so we were at the International Center, and we had 2 blocks to walk to go to the ceremony, which was only for the 3 of us. And it was raining cats and dogs, and we were dressed in traditional robes and with the wooden clogs, the geta, and with the tabi socks, and we had to walk in the rain those 2 blocks. And I remember getting to the Honganji. We climb up the stairs and you get onto the tatami mats. And my socks were so wet that it was making a sound as we went up to the front. And then we get to the front and the patriarch comes out and says in English, "You have been brought here by profound causes and conditions." But he spoke both in English and in French, which really impressed me. So.
Thank you.
Was there a pivotal moment when you knew you wanted to become a Jodo Shinshu minister?
I don't think so. I think it was a gradual, in the beginning, I had an obligation to work as a minister for every year that I'd received scholarship money in Japan. So I came back, started at the San Francisco Buddhist Temple in 1977, February of 77, and thought that that would be and they thought it would be a temporary job. And I actually applied for some other jobs later on, went back to school, and when the telecommunications industry changed, I applied for a job that I should have gotten. And when I went in for the interview, I only realized later when she looked at my resume and she saw that I was a Buddhist minister, that she was, I fully convinced that she was a devout fundamentalist, and said, "Oh no, you could never," And I know I aced that test for that job, but I look back and I think, wow, how grateful I am that I didn't go in that direction. I stayed with the ministry. It was tough for the first 9 or 10 years, even coming to Seattle. I was taken under the wing of the Rimban at that time, Reverend Oochi, and I came to Seattle and started in 1986. And Reverend Ochi didn't speak English well at all. And we had another minister from Japan who didn't speak English. And so I was the only English speaking minister here. And he let me have kind of free reign as far as what I wanted to do. And, kind of protected me. And so after about 10 years here in Seattle, and people would say, "Oh, how long have you been here now?" And I'd say, "Oh, I've been here 10 years." And I'd say, "No, I thought it was like 4 or 5 years." And so gradually, you build up trust with people and you build up friendships. And I think at that point, I really, although it was difficult, a 6-day work week, often 7 for most of my career. And so we didn't we didn't travel. We didn't take vacations at a distance except to see relatives. So I would say probably, it was maybe 15, 20 years into my ministry that I was glad that I was a minister, and,
Thank you.
and also just so many people there were so many emotional things that happened, when you're with a family and you see someone who is close to death, people who have who I was me and my wife were both invited to come to someone who wanted to say goodbye to us, who said goodbye, very emotional, and then passed away a couple of days later. I mean, things like that really sensitize you to the human condition. And so, I'm very grateful for the people I've known.
And we're very grateful for all that you've done for the tradition and for the Sangha in Seattle and people around the country. I have read, and I think I've heard you refer to, or you've called Buddhism a cosmic ecology. What does that mean?
The image that in Chinese Buddhism that was used to convey that idea was it's called Indra's net, and supposedly the god Indra has a net that stretches in all directions to infinity, and at the intersection of each strand, the node, is a jewel. And in the jewel is reflected every other jewel, reflecting every other jewel. And as I've thought about that metaphor, um, I thought that is even inadequate in expressing cosmic ecology because you have to give it a more dynamic sense that everything is changing. So the facets are all changing, and you need to have a three-dimensional net, not just a two-dimensional net, and it becomes mind-boggling. I think that's why the expression inconceivable is used so often in Buddhism because we understand reality through our human mind, which is very limited, and it's a filtered, humanized reality. And I think in sophisticated meditations, they try to go beyond that to see consciousness in its unconditioned state. But don't ask me about that.
Thank you very much. That's great.
How did the EcoSangha movement begin, and what role did you play in shaping it within the BCA?
Well, I made the connection between Buddhism and ecology even when I was at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in the early 70s. The study of what's called in Japan Kegon Buddhism is the emphasis is on the profound sense of what's of in Sanskrit it's called pratitya samutpada, which is usually translated as interdependence, but it can also mean mutual co-arising, a kind of common identity, as with Indra's net, that interpenetration. So when I got to Seattle, I started thinking we really should try to start some type of an organization to not just in the BCA, but to bring Buddhists together of all denominations, because it's not just being a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist is to be an ecologist and a conservationist, but it's to be a Buddhist. And so it's I tried to promote this in BCA and also beyond. So at the Seattle University, I met the head of the Department of Philosophy, Dr. Jason Worth, who was an ordained Soto Zen priest, and he really liked that idea. And so he started an EcoSangha at Seattle University back in around 2000, the early 2000s. And then wonderful person from San Jose Betsuin, Karen Akahoshi, she came up to Seattle. She had connections here. Her father had been a Jodo Shinshu minister here in Seattle and also in Spokane and Alameda. And she came up and she wanted to start an EcoSangha in San Jose. And we talked for a long time. She started a very successful EcoSangha at San Jose Betsuin. And they, so I don't know if it's been successful in BCA, but a lot of places say, well, we're doing what an EcoSangha, we don't call ourselves an EcoSangha, but we're trying to incorporate those ideas into our practices at the temple. But so it's a work in progress. It certainly is a work in progress. I've been invited to so many different temples, including Ekoji,
Yeah.
5, 6 years ago, before the pandemic. I remember speaking there. I was invited to the Eastern District and had a very wonderful reception there with Reverend Hayashi.
Mm.
And so it seemed to resonate at Ekoji as well. So I hope you start an EcoSangha there. And it's, Buddhists have a hard time getting together. Buddhists of various traditions have a hard time getting together because we have, for instance, in Theravada Buddhism, there are like Nirvana, what we call Nirvana Day and Hanamatsuri and Bodhi Day, that's all incorporated into Vesak. And Vesak is done in the late spring in May, I think the first full moon in May, and in most traditions. So, we have a hard time cooperating because we don't have a day that we can uh, uh, celebrate in common. And so I thought, well, Earth Day would be a great day for us all to get together and say, to be a Buddhist is to be an ecologist and a conservationist. So it's not just science, but it's the commitment to finding a cure.
Mm.
And Reverend Castro has been very instrumental in Seattle's annual Earth Day celebration and service. This next question may seem like it's out of sync just a little bit, but I think it's all going to weave together as we go along here. But your article about the golden chain invites us to reflect on our limitations in compassion. How has your understanding of it evolved over time?
Well, I think as you get older, um, you have so many experiences that kind of sensitize you to the pain, difficulties of others. And I think just being able to stay alive for as many years. And I said, how did I get to be 77 years old? A lot of close calls in driving, But anyway, I think we become sensitized over time if we keep our eyes open and uh, certainly in regard to animals. When I was younger, I didn't understand. I was raised in a tradition uh, that said animals were put here for us to eat, or they don't have souls, and but even there, we found with the studying animal behavior that I mean, no animal wants to be killed, and this is exactly what the Buddha tells us, and all fear death, all seek life. Knowing this, who can you harm? And so um, I think just paying attention over time and having personal experiences in the family also, we, like I said, we become sensitized, I think.
Thank you.
You've shared your childhood memory of harming butterflies and later finding a new reverence for life through Buddhism. Can you tell us more about this transformation?
Yeah, I mean that I look back with great embarrassment. But I had to, in that article where I admitted that, I had to say, I mean, I was very brutish, as so many children are. I'll tell you a story that hopefully this will never get out, and and because it involves my grandson, and if he hears this at some point, he'll look back at himself as a 9-year-old and realize how much he's grown. But he is a vegetarian. He's been a vegetarian since he was 4 years old, and no one in the family can figure out how he became a vegetarian. But on Father's Day this year, my son had invited me over for a Father's Day brunch, and he served bacon. And so my grandson, being vegetarian, but my son said, well, this bacon tastes pretty good. So, if you want to eat a little bit, well, my grandson takes a little bit of bacon and he says, can I be a vegetarian and only eat bacon? So that was some time ago. He's still a vegetarian. And I really admire that. I wish that I could be more careful in the way I eat. And this is why I believe wholeheartedly in the attitude of mottai nai, Things are not put here for me. It's important for me to recognize that I live at the expense of other forms of life and to curb my appetite, um, and uh, to be responsible that even if I consume another uh, life form, that I have a responsibility not to waste and to try to turn that energy into enlightened action if possible. But it's a very humbling experience when we think about our eating habits. And this is why I think in Japanese, before people eat, and we practice it in our household, we say itadakimasu. And itadakimasu means it means receiving something like this from above, and it's not just food, but anything that we receive, it's itadakimasu. And there's a sense of humility in that and mindfulness, I think, in that, recognizing profound causes and conditions that bring anything to our table.
In his book, Old Paths, White Clouds, Thich Nhat Hanh relates a story where Shakyamuni was walking along and came upon a group of young children. And he watched one boy pull legs off of a little crab or a little critter of some kind. And he asked the children whether or not they thought the crab felt pain. And they all said yes. Does the crab have a father, a mother, a family? Yes. And eventually the children understood that these other living beings, sentient beings, also deserved to live without suffering as much as possible. You've said that Buddhism helps us see ourselves and others. That's particularly useful in 2025. And so how can we help children cultivate that awareness that Buddhism helps us see ourselves and others?
Yeah, yeah. I I don't know. I have five grandchildren. I have two sons, and growing up, a lot of theories on child rearing, but when it comes right down to it, you know, I really don't know. I can't answer that question. Um, we, my, to follow up on that Father's Day story of my grandson, later on, uh, we were not that same day, but later on, we were in the backyard and there were ants that were an ant's nest. They have a little swimming pool that there was water and on the ground, and the ants were escaping from the water. And my grandson took the hose and started washing, like with glee, washing the ants away. And I said, like the Buddha said with the crab, those ants, they have a home and they want to live.
Yeah.
Um, but one thing that Buddhists don't talk about, I've asked Buddhist monks about this, is the taking of one life the same as the taking of another life, of the taking of the life of an ant the same as the taking of the life of a primate? And he said, yes. And I thought, as I've pondered that question, it seems to me that there's a hierarchy in animals' ability to experience pain. And it would, and it's the development of the central nervous system, the development of the brain. And it seems to me that it would be uh, more serious to take the life of a cow or a vertebrate than it would to take the life of a snail, for instance. And I don't know if any writing in Buddhism has been done on this, but I think that's a legitimate concern. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that eating escargot would not be the same as eating a steak. But anyway,
Okay.
In many of your columns, you refer to haiku, especially those by Isa Kobayashi. What draws you to Isa's poetry?
Well, Esau's love for animals and insects, and he uh, what he has a certain a charm about him, and his uh, his his reluctance to kill, and yet he reaches a point at which he can't help it. I guess during his time, there people were infested with fleas and lice, and so Isa, on the one hand, doesn't want to kill, but and he talks to the animals too. That's another charm I think that he has. But he says, uh, for instance, in killing a flea, uh, he has to bite it, I guess, because of the shell. So he bites it and he kills it, and then he writes a haiku that says, "Troublesome." Whether it's a lice or a flea, but he says, "Troublesome flea, become a Buddha by my hand." And so, on the one hand, he doesn't want to kill, but being a normal human being, he has his limits. Um, and it puts me in mind of a video that was done uh, with the Dalai Lama, where he's being interviewed by Bill Moyers. I think the name of it is Spirit and Nature. It's on, you can see it online. And Bill Moyers is interviewing the Dalai Lama, and there's a mosquito that lands on the Dalai Lama's arm. And he says, so, and the Dalai Lama, shushes it away. And so the Bill Moyers says, well, what if the mosquito comes back and bites you again? And the Dalai Lama says, well, maybe I'd let him take a little blood, or something. He says, well, what if he comes back again? And he says, well, I'd kind of, blow him away. He says, well, what if he keeps coming back? And the Dalai Lama goes, "Doop," with his finger, like he's going to kill it. And I thought, oh, that's Isa, is don't kill that mosquito, but at a certain point. And I think that was actually kind of embarrassing, an embarrassing moment, because the Dalai Lama is not supposed to kill anything. I mean, he's supposed to be an incarnation of Kannon Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of compassion. But here he is kind of indicating that he might take the mosquito's life. Um,
Andrea, I think you're probably getting a sense as to what the Seattle Temple was experiencing for all the years that this man provided us with the Dharma messages. Let's continue with the haiku for another moment. You quoted one of Isa's haiku that says, "Don't kill that fly. See how in fear it's wringing its hands and feet." What do you think this reveals about Isa?
the impulse not to kill, you know, and so if he kills the let's say the mosquito or the flea or the louse, um, he he's reluctant to do it. In Japan, when you're reluctant to do something, you kind of suck air in through your teeth, and so in I've seen this so often. So someone who would be reluctant to kill would you go, don't kill that fly. See how it's wringing its hands and feet in fear, and that's got to be the initial impulse. And when you talk about children, if you can cultivate that impulse in children not to want to kill, maybe later they will learn, that, well, we, as human beings, the human condition, we live at the expense of other forms of life. Even vegetarians live at the expense of other forms of life. In order to raise soybeans, you have to clear the field. You have to kill all the other forms of life. Anything that might, eat the soybeans, you have to get rid of them. So, in profound causes and conditions, we can't help but take life. That's when we talk about living harmoniously, we're still in the picture. even if we live in harmony, we're still living at the expense of other forms of life. We're just, as in Japan, they talk about living more harmoniously, living more symbiotically, not parasitically. That's the thrust of Japanese environmentalism is don't be parasites to the planet. Live symbiotically. Don't just take. And
Excellent. Thank you.
You often note that Jodo Shinshu doesn't mandate vegetarianism, yet you express reverence for the lives we consume. How do you personally approach food and what you might call ethical eating?
you know, I try to minimize the amount of beef or meat. I don't completely exclude that from my diet. It's interesting. I'm doing an article now on the Dalai Lama and Mottainai. And as I was doing some research on the Dalai Lama's diet, he says, and talking about his lunch meal, he said, well, I eat mostly non-vegetarian. And a lot of people assume that the Dalai Lama is a vegetarian. He said, no, I eat mostly non-vegetarian, although I prefer vegetarian. He said, I eat what I am given.
Yes.
And that's typical of monks is they say, I eat what I am given, which I have some issues with, making other people responsible for what they give me. It's, I don't, but that allows them to say, well, I'm not breaking the first precept against killing. See, because I didn't kill the animal. The monks are not supposed to request meat or to see the animal killed or to have the animal killed for them. But under those conditions, they can eat meat. But I think that's a kind of, you know, sidestepping the issue. Even if they are vegetarian, we still are breaking the first precept. This is why Jodo Shinshu Buddhists do not take the five precepts. Not that we don't try, it's aspirational. And actually, the Dalai Lama also says, he uses the expression universal responsibility. And he says universal responsibility is an ideal, it's aspirational. And so that guides our behavior. And in many ways that, I mean, we can have a real good dialogue, I think, with Tibetan Buddhists on that point. And that's what I'm trying to bring out in my article.
We'll look forward to that in an upcoming edition of Wheel of Dharma, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the EcoSangha resolution encourages temples to embody sustainability. What small steps can even the smallest sanghas take?
First, I would encourage them to have an Earth Day service where they can express the conviction that Buddhism, to be a Buddhist is automatically to be an ecologist and a conservationist. And that sensitizes the people, it gets them thinking that way. Then it's going to be natural after that to say, well, we really should get rid of styrofoam. That's a very polluting, and we should do this and that. And it varies. I've been to temples where they say, oh, we can't really wash our dishes. We're in the middle of a drought, in California. And I said, well, do what's appropriate for you to do. Some temples, they have people bring their own coffee mug. And in Seattle, we're trying to encourage that. In Hawaii, they have a movement called Green Honganji, and they give people a bag that has utensils and everything in it, and you bring that to the temple with you every week. So a lot of different things that can be done, and even the smallest is a step. And I was talking with one of our members on the BCA EcoSangha committee, and he was saying it's really hard for us to eliminate plastic water bottles because they're donated to our sukiyaki bazaar that they have. So he said it's hard to do that. But at another temple, actually at Fresno, they have now a dispenser, a water dispenser that they've incorporated where you can bring your own bottle and then it'll dispense water for you. Or you can buy aluminum recyclable water bottles of water, which are expensive, more expensive, but that's what they've incorporated into their festivals like the Bonodori Festival. So I think even the smallest temple, if they're sensitized, they'll start making those changes themselves.
Very good.
Oh,
Thank you.
excellent suggestions. Earlier this year, you began writing the monthly EcoSangha Perspectives column for the BCA's Wheel of Dharma. What were the causes and conditions that led to it, and what are your goals for the column?
Well, after retiring, I let too much time go by. I had a lot of things to take care of at my house and everything. So I got to do something. And um, uh, I as I started giving some video presentations, I tried to make a transcript. And I thought, well, you know, I'll just start writing some columns and for the Wheel of Dharma, and then the hope is. My motivation to live until I'm in my late 80s, then if I produce one a month, by the time I'm in my late 80s, I should have a book. And so hopefully I can have a collection of EcoSangha perspectives. And I think I might title it no sentient being left behind or something, which is a Jodo Shinshu perspective, and a play on no student left behind. But in Buddhism, no sentient being is left behind. All are embraced in Amida Buddha's boundless compassion, and what I refer to as unconditional love. And in I find in Jodo Shinshu, in the BCA, well, no, and even in Japanese Buddhism, when they use an English expression, they don't like to use the word love because love has kind of erotic overtones to Japanese. But I think unconditional love, because it's so prominently used in Western thought, is a good way of talking about, compassion and Amida Buddha's, unconditional love. And it's a good meditation to think about how impossible as a normal human being to experience unconditional love, even as a Christian, to experience unconditional love. But to bounce ourselves off of that it's Amida Buddha enlightening us to, our selfish nature. When we think about unconditional love, we think of all the conditions that we put on things, and that's a very good and mindful exercise, I think.
Thank you very much. We're getting down to the very end now. This is my last question. And I'm thinking about the Americanization of Buddhism, how we're going to carry on this tradition beyond our lifetimes. What teachings or values do you most hope that future generations of Jodo Shinshu Buddhists will carry forward?
Well, certainly that spirit of Mottainai that the Issei brought in. When I started at the San Francisco Buddhist Temple in 1977, there were a lot of Isseis still alive. And matter of fact, our board meetings were half in Japanese, half in English. And we had a room that was off the dining room. And in that room, the Issei would take all the clamshell containers, all the tofu containers, everything with plastic, newspapers, and they would wash them. They would carefully stack them one inside the other. and put them in this room so that we had clamshell styrofoam from floor to ceiling. They didn't want to throw it away. It's multi-dye. And so, now and I don't know when it changed, but I've gone back in recent years to the San Francisco temple, and that room is all cleared out. Somebody had to come in and take all of the bundled newspapers, everything, and dispose of it in some way. I hope that spirit of Mottainai, and also in I hope that there's a spirit of innovation, of creativity. In my EcoSangha shrine, I have the statue. Actually, I have the scroll with Amida Buddha's picture. And I think this really works well. At least it works for me. So I have this scroll of Amida Buddha's picture, and then in front of the scroll, I have the earth-touching posture of Shakyamuni Buddha. And earth-touching posture, of course, is our logo for EcoSangha. It's the Buddha is in touch with the earth. He's the one who is well-grounded. And and then the whole story behind the earth bearing witness to the Buddha's enlightenment. That's what we need to really emphasize. And Dr. Nobuo Haneda, who's very popular in our temples, he has said, that Shakyamuni Buddha has been displaced by Shinran Shonin in our shrine and in our teaching in a way. So Shakyamuni Buddha only came into this world to teach the truth of Amida Buddha. And I would say, well, yes and no. I mean, yes, you can say in a certain way, yes, but in another way, no. And certainly the emphasis on Shakyamuni Buddha as, as touching the earth, being in touch with the earth, the teaching of interdependence really needs more to be brought out more. And so I have that statue in front of the scroll of Amida Buddha. So Amida Buddha symbolizes enlightenment for all sentient beings as filled with blind passions, as we approach it as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. Okay, so that's everybody being enlightened. Shakyamuni Buddha is one example of that. And he's the historical. Amida Buddha is the mythological, you might say, the cosmic in nature. So they go together very well. And actually there is here and there is that kind of dynamic depiction. Some temples have incorporated that. I won't say some temples. I know of a temple that has incorporated that beside Seattle at one point. We did when I was still before I retired. But innovations like that. We tend to look to the Honganji all the time, and we need to stand on our own feet, I think, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, and to be innovative and creative. That's the spirit, I think, that I would love to see in the future. And we're far too conservative of an organization, I think.
Thank you very much. So with a little twist on our final question, what does EcoSangha mean to you?
It means that we all have a shared identity. We have an individual identity, but that's a relative identity. But in the true sense, we are all profoundly interrelated. A wonderful depiction of that is by Thich Nhat Hanh in his book on the Prajna Paramita called The Heart of Understanding. And in there he says, if you're a poet, you will see clearly that there's a cloud floating in the sheet of paper. Without the cloud, there would be no rain. Without the rain, we cannot have paper. Well, by the time he ends his first chapter, the whole universe is in that piece of paper. That's the profound sense of mutual identity of all existence. When I was at the San Francisco Buddhist Temple, there was a young woman, a high school student, who on the first day of after in September, after Dharma school started again, and I remember she was walking up the stairs, and I said, "Oh, Suzanne, great to see you back. What did you do over the summer?" And she looked kind of perplexed for a second. She said, "Well, I went to Chinese Baptist Bible camp." And when they found out I was a Buddhist, they asked me, "Do you have a personal relationship with the Buddha like we have with Jesus Christ?" And she was put on the defensive. And people are often, oh, they go, "Oh, we're a lesser because we don't have a personal relationship with the Buddha like they have with Jesus Christ." And I said, "Well, of course we don't. Because Buddha is our identity. You don't have a relationship with yourself. You find your identity." And so that question doesn't relate to being a Buddhist. And so, oh, okay, another way of seeing things. Now we do talk about relationships, but that's like I said, in a more relative sense. But in the absolute sense, there is a sense of mutual identity of all existence. And that's what Kegon Buddhism is about. And it's had a profound influence on Jodo Shinshu. When Dharmakara Bodhisattva becomes Amida Buddha, universal enlightenment is confirmed. And so we all participate in that. That's why we can say all sentient beings, not just human beings, participate in enlightenment.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. I learn so much from you every time we get together, if it's a casual conversation at the temple or here in this interview forum. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your stories, and your unwavering compassion for all sentient beings. This conversation has reminded us of the deep connections between our spiritual lives and the world around us.
Your leadership in the EcoSangha movement, your devotion to Shinran's teachings, and your family's artistic and spiritual contributions continue to shape and inspire communities like Ekoji and Seattle and so many others.
We're grateful to have had this time with you and know that your insights will stay with our listeners long after this episode ends.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this very special episode of Echo Ekoji. Be sure to like, follow, and share our podcast on YouTube and wherever you find your favorite Dharma talks. Reverend Castro, although this wasn't a formal service, would you lead us in closing Gasho?
You'll notice when I conclude the service that I say Namo Amida Buddha, not Namo Amida Butsu. And the reason for that is that when I was working as a minister and I would go to the nursing home that had Buddhists of various traditions, each tradition would say the Nembutsu in their own way. So the Vietnamese people would say Namo Adi Dapat, or the Chinese would say Namo Amitohu. I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly, but I thought, well, I don't say Butsu in English. I say Buddha. And so Namo Amida Butsu is Japanese. If I'm going to say it in America, why not say Namo, which is actually going back to the Sanskrit, Namo Amida Buddha. And for years now, I've been saying that, and it comes naturally now. So anyway, if you would join me in closing Gasho. Namo Amida Buddha.
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 Namo Amida Buddha.